Hi there, and welcome to The Artist Craft. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and on this week's episode of The Artist Craft, we're featuring science fiction author Edward M. Lerner. Edward is the author of Small Miracles, which was published just recently with Tor Forge, a major New York publisher. And in this interview, I had the opportunity to ask him about his writing process, his influence, his research that went into writing Small Miracles. I was absolutely thrilled to have Edward here in North Carolina and had the opportunity to interview him. And want to send a shout out to Edward if he's watching the show to say thank you for visiting us here in North Carolina and hope to have you back soon. If you're watching the show and you are an aspiring writer and you have a book, or maybe you've considered writing a book and haven't written it yet, I would encourage you to visit my website, howtopublishabook.org. At howtopublishabook.org, you'll find information like the interview I'm featuring here today on The Artist Craft with Edward M. Lerner, as well as interviews with literary agents, publishing professionals, editors, publicists, marketing personnel, all kinds of information about the changing landscape of publishing going into 2010. And you can find out all kinds of information about how to actually publish your book. What is the best way to publish a book in 2010. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and I would encourage you to visit the website, howtopublishabook.org. But for now, I'd like for you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this interview, which I was thrilled to be able to do, with science fiction author Edward M. Lerner, author of Small Miracles. Enjoy the interview. So tell us a little bit about Small Miracles. What is the story about?
One reviewer called Small Miracles a near-future, near-apocalyptic thriller, which I thought was a great turn of phrase. More specifically, it's a medical nanotech thriller. Medical speaks for itself, but nanotech is newer technology. It deals with technology at the scale of individual human cells or smaller, which lets us build things like little robots to scuttle about our body through every blood vessel and nip away bits of cholesterol so we can all live forever. In Small Miracles, the nanobots aren't nearly that advanced. What they can do is go through the bloodstream to the site of any internal bleeding and apply an artificial coagulant exactly where it's needed. So it's kind of the ultimate in first aid. And it's a very fortunate technology for the hero, Brent Cleary, who is demonstrating this technology on a police ride-along, along with a nanotech-enabled protective suit. And he, as a result, is the sole survivor of a gas pipeline explosion. Now that does two things. Naturally, the military is suddenly awfully fascinated with this technology and thinks this would be a really keen thing to have a large-scale field trial with, because in my near future, unfortunately, there are still wars going on. And secondly, it makes people very uninterested in worrying about little anomalies like the fact that our survivor is not quite the same person he was before.
Would you say it's a fair comparison to compare a book like your book, like Small Miracles, to the writing of Michael Crichton?
It's a quite good comparison, although I can't claim to have sold as many books as he has. Yes, a Crichton book is a techno-thriller. He researched his subjects very thoroughly, and technology was certainly a star of his books, and I like to think it's a star in mine. But there's an important difference, I think, or maybe the difference is between early Crichton and late Crichton. There's a pattern in his books that the bad guys, in a sense, are scientists and technologists. It's as if he doesn't much like science, and everything is a disaster story in the making. Now, there's a role for that in making the story dramatic, but eventually I found it kind of tiresome and worrisome that he was always portraying the technologists as so irresponsible. What I try to do in Small Miracles, and before that in Fool's Experiments, the AI story, was to show that these are emergent technologies. We don't understand them that well. There is a lot of potential for surprise no matter how conscientious we are. just as one data point, in the human body there's something like 100,000 proteins. We know the purpose of very few of those. And these nanobots that I talk about in the book are of the same scale. So it takes, it's appropriate to have some humility about introducing nanobots into the human body despite the tremendous potential.
Now, what kind of research did you do for Small Miracles?
The primary research was into medicine and nanotech. So on the nanotech side, I went to a 2-day conference where the leaders of the nanotech field were rolling out their roadmap for where they saw this technology going over the next 30 years. I couldn't have asked for a better conference, and it was even held within a decent commuting distance of my house. And because people in the field wanted to see the technology used right in fiction, they were more than happy to answer questions, so that was great. In the case of medicine, I dragooned 3 doctors that I know and a couple of biophysicists that I know and a biologist, neurologist, and interrogated them all fairly mercilessly. And it was a good thing that I knew so many people I could ask questions of, because it would have been grossly unfair to ask that many questions of anyone. Finally, I asked a doctor friend who also was a science fiction writer to read the whole book cover to cover before I submitted it to make sure there were no glaring problems. And in fact, he came back with only one very minor thing, which made me feel pretty good.
How did your background in physics and computer science ground you or influence your writing in Small Miracles?
Well, the thing about nanotechnology is it's a very new field. At this point, the products that people talk about that are nanotech are materials that are more perfect than what's been built before. If you can build things with atomic precision and put atoms pretty much where you want them, then you can have stronger materials, and we use them for trivial things like better golf clubs. Nanotech has yet to get to the stage of actually building complex machines. So for story purposes, I had to do a lot of extrapolation, and that's where the physics and the computer science came in, because I had to think about, well, physically, how is this going to work? You scale things down, and the rules of physics are a little different. Brownian motion kicks in. If you remember that from chemistry, you know, if you look at smoke, cigarette smoke under a microscope, the smoke particles are bouncing around because they're being hit by air molecules. Well, the same thing happens in every cell of your body, and if you don't take that into account, your machines don't work right. And computer science was very relevant because you have these little machines, they have to be controlled. It's not like you can put a radio antenna on each of them and give them orders. They have to be self-directed. And so I was thinking throughout writing the book, how would I write the programs to run these little autonomous robots and trust them to go running around my body?
That's very neat. So what exactly is nanotechnology, and how does it factor into Small Miracles? What exactly is nanotechnology?
Well, the simplest definition is building at the nanometer scale. A nanometer, from the Greek root, is a billionth of a meter. I mean, that's really small. It's kind of intermediate between individual atoms and individual bacteria. But a more sophisticated definition of what is nanotechnology is it's building things with atomic precision. It's being able to put atoms exactly where you want them. If you can build steel, for example, without all the microscopic voids and gaps and impurities, it turns out that the steel will be about 100 times stronger. So that's one way to get much better mileage with our cars, to make them weigh about 1/100th as much as they do right now and still be just as strong.
So what kinds of ways are people applying nanotechnology now, and how realistic is some of the nanotechnology that's introduced in Small Miracles?
The commercial products right now are strictly materials. I mentioned golf clubs. The carbon fiber composite material being used to build the Boeing Dreamliner is arguably nanotech, although some people say it's slightly larger scale than that. I mean, the plane is obviously huge, but the materials that are being used have some small aspects to it. A very popular topic in the popular science press is carbon nanotubes, which are a unique form of carbon that conducts electricity and is stronger than steel. And once we can make them long enough, we can build space elevators with them and just lift stuff to orbit. But unfortunately, right now, the best we can do is make them about 4 inches long. So we have a ways to go. But that's products. If you look in the lab, so we can see what's coming in 5–10 years, people are starting to build little nanotech components, motors, gears. I saw some neat video at this conference of tiny little machines. For example, there was one that was powered by light. You shine a light on these little nano machines and they'll climb uphill or swim against a current. And they'll go thousands of times their length, which is pretty respectable. So that's in the lab, and then the next step is going to be combining those motors and gears and other gadgets into complex machines.
Now, is Small Miracles science fiction or a techno thriller, and how do you define both of those yourself?
Science fiction is a story in which if you took out the science, something essential is gone from the story. So setting a story on another planet but having it otherwise be a shoot 'em up doesn't make it science fiction. That's just a horse opera in space. If you take the science out of, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey, without HAL, the artificial intelligence, without the extraterrestrial intelligences, without space travel, you don't have a story. So 2001 is certainly science fiction because you need the science. A techno-thriller can be viewed as a form of science fiction, and many people do, but to some people there are two pronounced differences. One is the degree of background information that the reader wants and expects. So if you take a Tom Clancy book, for example, it's fairly typical to have fairly lengthy, I won't say a digression, but side discussions of some weapon system, how the submarine or the plane or gunpowder came about. You'll see less of that in something that's positioning itself as science fiction. And a science fiction author will also want to spend more time talking about how this nifty new technology he's excited about will affect society.
Hey folks, you are watching The Artist Craft on Raleigh Television Network Channel 10. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and you've been watching an interview I was able to do with science fiction author Edward M. Lerner just a few weeks ago here in lovely North Carolina. I should say, if you're watching the show tonight and you've ever considered writing a book, or perhaps you've written a book and don't know exactly what to do with it, I would encourage you to visit my website, howtopublishabook.org. At howtopublishabook.org, you'll find interviews like the one we're featuring here this week on The Artist Craft with author Edward M. Lerner. You'll find interviews with literary agents, publishing professionals. You'll find information on how to actually craft and write your book, in addition to how to actually publish a book. You'll find information on the changing landscape of publishing going into 2010, and information and ideas on exactly the best way to publish your book here in 2010. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and you are watching The Artist Craft here on Raleigh Television Network Channel 10. I want to kick it back into the interview with Edward M. Lerner. Again, Edward is the author of Small Miracles. Enjoy the interview. Now, your previous novel, Fool's Experiments, was also a near-future thriller in which a much-discussed coming technology, in that case artificial intelligence, threatens to destroy civilization. Is this a theme in your work that is developing?
Well, it's sort of fun to think about breaking everything, especially when you don't have to live with the consequences. So, sure, that's part of it. But more than that, I'm fascinated with a set of technologies that are potentially revolutionary, at the scale of computing itself. If you look at artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, genetic engineering, they all have the potential of reaching the point of self-replication. And if that happens, there will truly be a cascading revolutionary effect. I don't see any of those technologies as being on the cusp of achieving those breakthroughs, but just the potential for it makes them extremely fascinating, and because they're new technologies, they're also things that haven't been done to death in fiction. So, chance to be novel.
Is it fair to characterize your view of new technologies as cautionary?
To an extent, they're cautionary. I will admit that on occasion I just write about a situation because it's fun to write about. Sometimes it's just entertainment. But yes, there's also an aspect of it that says, do these things right. You talked about techno-thrillers, and one of the premier authors of techno-thrillers was Michael Crichton. And the thing is, in a Crichton novel, especially the later ones, the scientists and the entrepreneurs and the engineers were always careless or venal or greedy or in some way, very culpable in the disaster that a Crichton book always throws at you. I deal with some of the same sorts of technologies, but I try to set things up so it's more a matter of just pointing out we need to approach these technologies with a degree of humility. There's so much about biology that we don't understand, which we find out every time the experts change the guidelines on something. That the notion of introducing nanoscale robots to run around our body and try to fix things should be approached with a degree of humility.
Absolutely. So is Crichton then saying, that the technology is potentially evil, or is it that people using the technology are incompetent or greedy or what have you that causes the problem? And how's that different from your view of technology?
Well, certainly people aren't perfect and people will have flaws and motives. But especially in the later Crichton books, my concern was he just kept reinforcing this stereotype of technologists. Do technologists ever have ulterior motives? Are they ever less than perfect in their safeguards? Of course they are. But I think they're also generally trying to be conscientious, and even people who hope to make money when their company goes public generally want to be responsible about things.
Fair enough. What is the earliest science fiction novel you can remember reading?
It has to be one of the Heinlein juveniles. I read them all over and over, so it's hard to remember which was which, but some of the leading contenders would be Rocket Ship Ganymede, Have Spacesuit Will Travel, Star Beast, Double Star, all good books.
Let's talk a little bit about the writing process for this. I think the nanotechnology is absolutely fascinating. It's something I don't know a whole lot about that I would like to know a lot more about. But let's talk a little bit about your writing process here for Small Miracles. How long did it take to write? What is your daily routine with writing? Do you revise as you go along? Those kinds of things.
It took me about 9 months of writing time, although I won't say that every day of the 9 months I was working on this. The thing about writing and self-employment is you're always juggling, and so there were other things going on. I try to be at my desk roughly 10 to 6 every day, but that's not the whole writing routine. An important part of my routine anyway is getting up and away from my desk. I can write text sitting at my desk. I can't necessarily develop plot sitting there. Mm-hmm. For plot, I have to be away. So I can be taking a walk, I can be taking a shower, I can be waking up in the middle of the night and writing notes, and I do that. Sometimes I can even read them the next morning. And that's part of the writing process.
Excellent. So you've got a great question here. Is Small Miracles science fiction or a techno thriller? You know, I've seen it called both. How do you describe it exactly? And what's the difference between the two in your mind as you're writing?
It's hard to get any two people to agree on what the difference is between them. Some people feel that if it's near future and it's on Earth, that makes it a techno thriller rather than science fiction. I don't completely hold with that, although it's certainly true that if you break those rules and you go off Earth and you go into the far future, it isn't a techno thriller. I think what makes something definitively a techno thriller rather than hard SF is the degree of background that you expose. You know, if you take a book like a Tom Clancy, his audience is fine with a 5-page digression on the history of gunpowder. Once you leave specifically the techno thriller genre, people aren't really looking for quite that much background. So one of the distinguishing characteristics in my mind is how much of that background information you can convey to the reader and what their expectations are. By that standard, I say this book is kind of on the cusp. It's probably closer to what's called hard science fiction, where hard means rigorous science, not difficult to read. The other thing about techno thrillers that I think is different is to what extent this new technology that's the focus of the book permeates society. In an awful lot of techno thrillers, I've noticed that the new technology is isolated, it's quarantined, and affects military technology, for example, or it's the center of a spy probe. Those are very common themes in techno thrillers. And somehow this neat technology doesn't have an impact on society. Science fiction authors tend to be interested in saying, okay, well, this technology is presumed to exist for my story. How is that going to remake society?
Excellent. Well, the author is Edward M. Lerner. The book is Small Miracles, and we're talking a little bit about some of the research, some of the background, the writing process that goes into writing a novel like this. So where do you think, Ed, your fascination with technology and science, where did it first take root? Do you have an early memory of something that really sparked your interest in technology and science?
There are two things. One is just a function of my age. I was at an impressionable age when Sputnik went up. So I grew up with the early space program. And I think for people of my approximate age, that was a very formative thing. The other factor is I've loved science fiction for I don't know how long. I'm sure it was no later than 4th grade or so. And I remember going through every bit of science fiction in the school library and at the local branch library, everything I could get my hands on.
Now, can you tell us the story of how you came to work with Larry Niven?
I can indeed. It happened at the World Science Fiction Convention in 2004. Larry and I were on a panel together. The panel was called My Favorite Planet. That's something of a perennial favorite at World Cons. And what the panelists always talk about is a place, real or imaginary, that they would like to visit. When my turn came, I picked the Fleet of Worlds, which is a setting that is glimpsed in Larry's best-known novel, Ringworld. The Fleet of Worlds is a group of 5 worlds flying through space at most of the speed of light, running from a disaster, home to 1 trillion alien aliens. And that's one heck of a setting. And we barely glimpse it. And the glimpses, for me, raised more questions than they answered. So I said, Larry, you need to write a book about that. He said, I don't have a plot for that. So I got in touch with him real soon after and said, well, I do. And at this point, we've completed 3 books. We've turned in our 4th, and we're talking about a 5th.
So what was the experience like seeing the adaptation of your short story, Grandpa, made into a film?
Okay. Well, Grandpa is a story about 1,000 words long or 1,000 words short, depending how you want to look at it. So just the notion that it would be a movie is a hoot in the first place. And It's about, as you know, the grandfather paradox of time travel. If time travel is possible, then I can go back in time and kill my grandfather, but then how was it possible that I went back in time and killed my grandfather, because I didn't exist? And it's an interesting paradox and conundrum. So I was contacted by a Canadian filmmaker who was looking for a film so he could build a portfolio for himself. He had a long history in the film industry, but he wanted to do some independent directing, and he had picked my little story as his showpiece, and I thought that was great. That was very flattering. When he did make it into a movie, it ran about 7 minutes. It had some adaptation for the screen and to keep the special effects budget down, but it was just a hoot to watch. And I don't recall if I've posted this anywhere, but there is a remake coming. So not only have I gone to the big screen, but I've gone to the big screen, and now in the Hollywood trend, I'll have my remake.
Hey folks, you are watching The Artist Craft on Raleigh Television Network Channel 10, and I am your host, Stacey Cochran. You've been watching an interview I was able to do a few weeks ago with Edward M. Lerner, who is the author of Small Miracles. I was absolutely thrilled to have Edward in studio here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I want to send a big thank you out to Edward if he's watching the interview for visiting us here in North Carolina. I should say as well, if you're watching the show and you've ever considered writing a book, if you've got a book inside of you, a memoir, a novel, a science fiction novel, you name it, if you've got it inside of you and you don't know how to write it, you should visit my website, howtopublishabook.org. At howtopublishabook.org, you'll find interviews I've done with authors like Edward M. Lerner, as well as literary agents like Stacey Decker and Alan Guthrie. You'll find a wealth of information on actually how to publish your book so that you'll have some kind of end target inside as you're beginning your process, or perhaps you're done with your book and you don't know exactly how to go about publishing it. All of those questions can be answered if you visit the site howtopublishabook.org. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and I want to thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Artist Craft. Stay tuned for next week's episode. We're going to be featuring some poetry by a local poet here in North Carolina, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be bringing that interview, and we're hoping to have even better interviews and greater interviews as 2010 proceeds. So for all of us here at The Artist Craft, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks so much.